Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Brooke, Skylar, Richardson? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So first I'll take a quick look at the background in this case. I'll move to the timeline of the crime, and then I'll offer my analysis. This story takes place in Carlisle, Ohio. This is a small town with a population of about 5,000 people. The Richardson family is trying to support their daughter Brooke, who goes by her middle name, Skyler, as she struggles with a dysregulation of eating. The challenge has existed for a while. They first noticed it when Skyler was 12 years old. It appears as though the demands of cheerleading may have contributed to the problem. As part of that activity, Skylar needed to be easy to throw in the air and catch, so there was pressure not to be heavier than necessary. Skylar managed her weight by vomiting, but when the cheerleading season was over, she would eat a lot, but then the cycle would repeat. She was not responsive to attempts at intervention, including by mental health professionals. She was diagnosed with body dysmorphia, in addition to struggles with eating. In July of 2016, as Skylar was preparing for her senior year of high school, she started dating her friend's cousin. The relationship would be over in about 6 months. Skylar found a new boyfriend at the beginning of 2017, a boy named Brandon. During this relationship, Skylar gained weight and looked healthy. There were concerns that it might occur to Skylar and Brandon that sex was a possibility. Skylar's mother took her to a physician to get birth control. However, Skylar was already 8 months pregnant. The father was her friend's cousin. Only Skylar and the physician knew about the pregnancy. Just over a week later, Skylar and her boyfriend went to the prom. Nobody could tell that she was pregnant, even though she was wearing a prom dress. About 2 days later, on May 7, 2017, the police arrived at the family home and said they needed to talk to Skylar. They claimed she was not in any trouble, but they were lying in accordance with their training. The police had heard from Skylar's physician, who said that Skylar reported burying her baby in the backyard after giving birth. Unaware of this allegation, Skylar's father drove Skylar to the police station, a move he would come to regret. Skylar was interrogated alone. The police would not allow anybody else to be in the interrogation room with her. The police started applying pressure to her right away. Skylar admitted to the police that she gave birth to her baby in the bathroom at home and admitted to burying her in the backyard, but claimed that the baby was stillborn. The police let Skylar go home with her parents, but after recovering the baby from the backyard, they found signs that the bones of the baby had been burned. Skylar denied this accusation. Not long after, she changed her story. Now she admitted using a lighter, and she said that the baby may have been born alive. The police arrested Skylar for reckless homicide. The grand jury would end up indicting Skylar for aggravated murder, involuntary manslaughter, child endangerment, and gross abuse of a corpse. The aggravated murder charge carried a mandatory life sentence. In July of 2019, before the trial started, the prosecution offered Skylar a plea deal. Plead guilty to all the charges, and they would drop the aggravated murder charge. Skylar turned down the deal, even though she would have only faced a maximum of 15 years in prison as opposed to life in prison. The trial started in September of 2019. The prosecution argued that this was murder. Skylar suffocated her baby. She did so to protect her perfect life. She was vain. The defense argued that there was no evidence a homicide had been committed, except for the confession, which they characterized as false. The jury would find Skylar not guilty of aggravated murder, involuntary manslaughter, or child endangerment, but they did find her guilty of gross abuse of a corpse, which is a felony. Skylar would only serve 1 year on probation because the judge granted her request to end the probation 2 years early. The judge viewed probation as rehabilitative and not punitive. Therefore, he saw no advantage to continuing the probation. Her felony conviction will probably hold her back from achieving many of her goals in life. Perhaps the judge factored that in as well. It's a life sentence in a way. Now moving to my analysis. As far as mental health, we know that Skylar was diagnosed with a few disorders: dependent personality disorder, which became an area of focus in the trial, body dysmorphic disorder, this was discussed a little bit, and eating disorders. Some reports made specific mention of anorexia and bulimia. This was actually used against her at the trial in one sense. The prosecution made it seem like this was really her vanity and not a legitimate disorder. It was also used for her in another sense, offering an explanation of how the baby died that was not murder. Rather, restricted development could have caused death. One of the key questions that comes to mind in this case is, was Skylar Richardson truly not guilty of the more serious charges? Let's look at the evidence both for and against the idea that she was guilty. Looking at the evidence for. The confession, this always looks bad when somebody confesses. Being pregnant by one boyfriend but being with another. The father of the baby was not Skylar's current boyfriend, so her motive for murder may have been to make sure that the current boyfriend did not find out. Understandably, he might have been a little alarmed if he knew she was pregnant by somebody else. That's usually the type of thing people notice in a relationship. Certain text messages were found that did not look good. One was a text that Skylar sent to her mother just a few hours after burying the baby. Skylar wrote, "I am literally speechless with how happy I am. My belly is back, OMG, and I'm never, ever, ever, ever letting it get like this again." This supports the prosecution's theory that Skylar was preoccupied with the way that she looked. Again, she had a lot of vanity. She was trying to protect this perfect image, and she wasn't going to let anything get in her way. The last item that made her look guilty was the fact that some of her behaviors and characteristics appeared to be associated with neonaticide. For example, there was a lack of preparation for having a baby. There were no diapers, no clothing, no furniture. She was under 25 years of age, and she was not married, two risk factors for this type of homicide. No weapons were used in the homicide, and she concealed her pregnancy. Other than actually bearing the baby, this was probably the most inculpatory factor. This did not look good for her. It makes it seem as though she was planning this all along. Now looking at the factors that support innocence. She may have falsely confessed. She was pressured with promises that she would not be punished if she told the truth. The police introduced the idea of fire. That did not come from Skylar. That came from the police. The police held her hand when she extended it, which changed the dynamic of the relationship to something non-professional. The forensic anthropologist who had originally claimed that the bones had been exposed to fire now changed her story. She was now saying there was no evidence to support the conclusion that fire was involved. So fire was never involved, and again, the police introduced the idea of fire, and then Skylar seemed to agree with it. This really makes it look like it was a false confession. Physicians who testified admitted there was no way to prove the baby was born alive. There was also testimony suggesting that Skylar's eating behavior may have restricted the development of the baby, may have contributed to the death, as I mentioned before. A mental health professional testified that Skylar had been abused by a boy when she was 12, and this contributed to the development of dependent personality disorder. The symptoms of this disorder may have made it difficult for Skylar to resist confessing. So with all that in mind, moving back to that question, was Skylar actually guilty, even though she was found not guilty? This is a difficult case. There's just not a lot of evidence about what happened on the day of the alleged homicide. I think she was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, so I think the jury made the correct decision. But as far as actual guilt, like not using the legal standard, but rather, did she really do it or not? My guess is that she did not. But that is just my theory. I think that it makes sense that the baby was stillborn and that she went ahead and buried it because she was callous and perhaps somewhat focused on hiding that information from other people, like she just didn't want other people to find out. That is a far cry from being a killer, although, of course, it doesn't look good. Again, it points to callousness and a lack of empathy. Another item that leads me to believe she's not guilty, again, actually not guilty, is her refusal of the plea deal. The prosecutors offered a good plea deal, 15 years maximum. she probably would have been sentenced to something like 8 to 10 years and been out in something like 5 to 6 years. She was going to face the possibility of life in prison without parole just to avoid having to serve 5 or 6 years. Either she was truly not guilty or she believed she was not guilty. I realized that things worked out for her better in the end, like 1 felony conviction and probation as opposed to 5 or 6 years. But not knowing that information, that was an extremely risky move. Risking life in prison to save, again, 5 or 6 years, that's hard to imagine. Even if she was going to serve the entire 15 years, that was still a good deal. So that was, again, an incredibly risky move. So, as I mentioned, either it indicates that she believed she was not guilty, or perhaps it was something like impulsivity or just bad judgment. So kind of an interesting situation that somebody would turn down a plea deal like that. As far as her confession, false confessions happen all the time. Considering her age and the high-pressure tactics used by the police, I believe her confession carries little weight, if any weight at all. This is just another example of how it's difficult to trust the police. They are trained to deceive. When interacting with law enforcement, citizens need to always assume the police could be lying. Never talk to the police without an attorney. The last area I want to cover here involves dependent personality disorder. Again, this is one of the disorders with which Skylar was diagnosed, and it factored into the trial. Again, there was this idea that this disorder is consistent with somebody making a false confession. So let's take a look at this idea. Could this have really led to a false confession? There are 8 symptom criteria for dependent personality disorder, which I will refer to as DPD. 5 must be met for a diagnosis. We don't know how many Skylar met, but based on the fact that she was diagnosed, it's reasonable to believe that at least 5 of the symptoms were endorsed. Here are the symptoms. Has difficulty making everyday decisions, needs others to assume responsibility for most major areas of their life, has difficulty expressing disagreement with others, has difficulty initiating projects, goes to excessive lengths to obtain nurturance and support from others, feels uncomfortable or helpless when alone because of exaggerated fears of being unable to care for themselves, urgently seeks another relationship as a source of care and support when a close relationship ends, and the 8th symptom criterion is unrealistically preoccupied with fears of being left to take care of themselves. The only symptom that appears to be strongly connected with a false confession would be the having difficulty expressing disagreement with others. But if we look beyond the symptom criteria at the research on the disorder, we see that this theory about the connection to false confessions does seem to make sense. DPD is associated with a personality profile of low openness to experience, low conscientiousness, low extroversion, high agreeableness, and high neuroticism, a profile that is fairly easy for the police to manipulate. In addition, people with DPD tend to exhibit self-blaming behaviors, so they accept blame that perhaps they do not actually deserve. DPD affects about 1% of the population. Due to its attributes, a person with the disorder may be less likely to have interaction with law enforcement because people who are fearful and low in assertiveness tend to avoid criminality. Even still, police officers will encounter people with DPD from time to time, and when they do, the officers will have a tremendous advantage using their deceptive tactics. Police tactics do not take into account that some people may have mental disorders, which could lead to a false confession. This simply lends more support to ban the practice of police deception. False confessions and the false convictions that sometimes come about because of them cheat victims out of justice and create additional victims. If the tactics unfairly discriminate against people with certain mental illnesses, how can those tactics be justified? One simple way to get around most of these problems would be to mandate suspects talk to a mental health professional and a lawyer before being interviewed. This would force the police to actually conduct a proper investigation instead of relying on manipulating vulnerable people. Those are my thoughts on the case of Brooke, Skyler, Richardson. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.